The SCP Foundation had dealt with horrors of every kind: world-ending entities, mind-bending spatial anomalies, and objects that could rewrite the very fabric of reality. Yet nothing, not even the most malicious Keter-class SCP, could match the chaos of Dr. Gerald behind the wheel. It wasn't just bad driving. It was as if the act of Gerald operating a vehicle bent the laws of probability, physics, and good sense into pretzels. A simple bus trip meant to ferry a group of D-Class personnel between sites somehow devolved into an impromptu demolition derby, complete with a flaming pickup truck, a defeated ice cream van, and countless staff fleeing for their lives. Gerald, of course, emerged unscathed, wearing a grin that suggested he'd thoroughly enjoyed himself. Another time, a quick ride through a quiet town on a borrowed moped left half the population homeless, and the other half too stunned to describe what had happened. And then there was the infamous rollerblade incident at Aurea headquarters. A disaster so thorough it entered Foundation lore as the day physics called in sick. Dr. Gerald's unique gift had earned him a reputation as both a marvel of scientific curiosity and a walking insurance nightmare. The containment staff had learned to live with the chaos, or at least survive it. Reinforced structures, evacuation protocols, and a remarkable tolerance for absurdity had become second nature when Gerald was around. Yet today, even the most seasoned researchers looked uneasy, because today, Gerald was about to test SCP-666-J. The object in question was a rusted 1968 Chevrolet El Camino, infamous for its unsettling teleportation abilities. Its drivers would vanish the moment they turned the ignition, only to reappear in strange locations, sometimes intact, often not. Survivors often describe their trips as confusing at best. Pairing SCP-666-J with Gerald's vehicular curse was an idea so reckless, it bordered on genius or madness. The researchers weren't sure which. The El Camino sat in the middle of the reinforced testing chamber, its battered frame a stark contrast to the high-tech surroundings. Rust streaked its body like battle scars, and a persistent smell of motor oil seemed to emanate from its very essence. The key in the ignition, permanently stuck, gleamed faintly under the fluorescent lights. "Is it just me?" one researcher whispered. "Or does that car look angrier than usual?" The colleague beside them shook their head and muttered something about how ridiculous it was to assign emotions to a machine. But the first researcher didn't look convinced. Their gaze lingered on the screen, unease spreading across their face. They gestured to the observation monitor, where Gerald was strolling toward the chamber with the carefree air of a man who had never personally witnessed the carnage he caused. "He's practically an anomaly himself." Gerald entered the chamber, hands in his lab coat pockets, a smile on his face. He paused in front of SCP-666-J, tilting his head as if admiring a work of art. "Haven't seen one of these in years," he mused. "Classic lines, nice patina." From the observation room, the lead researcher sighed audibly. Patina, they thought bitterly. It's rust, just rust. Unbothered, Gerald ran his hand along the hood, leaving a streak in the layer of grime. "Feels solid," he said, his voice carrying through the intercom. "Now let's see what she's got." The room fell silent as Gerald opened the driver's side door. The creak of the hinges sounded unnervingly like a groan. The researchers exchanged glances. "That's normal, right?" someone asked. Nobody answered. Gerald climbed into the seat, which let out a faint wheeze as it sagged under his weight. He adjusted the rearview mirror with a casual flick, despite the fact that the chamber was empty behind him. Then he tapped the dashboard, gave the horn a light press, and nodded approvingly. "Good acoustics," he said. The researchers in the observation room held their breath. One of them mumbled something about how relaxed Gerald always looked, even in the face of certain chaos. Another, without lifting their eyes from the monitor, said quietly, "That's because he's the only one who ever survives." Gerald reached for the ignition, the key almost daring him to proceed. With the exaggerated confidence of someone about to unleash mayhem, Gerald turned the key. For a moment, nothing happened. The El Camino sat there, silent and unassuming. Then, without warning, the engine roared to life. The sound was unnatural. less car starting, and more angry mechanical deity awakening from an eons-long slumber. The air in the chamber grew heavy, vibrating with an ominous hum. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically, as if the car was pulling energy directly from the facility itself. And then, the El Camino vanished. It did not fade or teleport quietly. It blinked out of existence with a deafening pop, leaving behind a rush of displaced air that sent loose papers flying across the observation room. The researchers barely had time to react before the car reappeared, suspended upside down in the corner of the chamber. Gravity caught up, and the car crashed to the floor with a resounding clang. The impact reverberated through the room, sending cracks racing across the reinforced concrete walls. The Camino idled briefly, as if considering its next move before vanishing again.
What the? Where did it go?
Someone shouted. Monitors flickered, struggling to keep up with the car's erratic teleportation. It reappeared moments later outside the chamber, perched precariously on a guardrail overlooking the facility's cafeteria. A nearby tree spontaneously combusted. Flames licked upwards as the car disappeared again, reappearing inside the chamber for a fraction of a second, before vanishing once more. Each teleportation left behind its own absurd brand of destruction. A chair in the observation room inexplicably lost one of its legs, collapsing to the floor. A crack snaked up the chamber's back wall, chunks of concrete falling in its wake. One unlucky researcher stared in horror as their clipboard disassembled itself in their hands, screws and hinges flying off as if propelled by an invisible force. The El Camino reappeared once more, this time in the chamber's center. Its tires screeched against the floor as it skidded to a stop. The reinforced walls groaned under the strain, an ominous crack that made everyone in the observation room wince. Gerald gave the dashboard a thoughtful tap. Then he looked up at the observation window, his expression alight with curiosity.
Hey!
He called, loud enough to cut through the commotion. What happens if I press the horn?
Don't!
The lead researcher started, but it was too late. Gerald pressed the horn. The sound that erupted was not a honk. It was a piercing, otherworldly wail that rattled the entire facility. Lights pulsed violently while the El Camino shuddered, glowing faintly red as though building up an impossible amount of energy. For a moment, it was suspended a few feet off the ground, spinning lazily like a bizarre mechanical top. Then, with a final screech, the car launched itself into the ceiling. Concrete cracked and splintered as debris rained down. The El Camino hung there for a moment, defying all logic before crashing back to the floor in a heap of mangled metal and smoke. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then went silent. The room was eerily quiet, save for the faint hiss of steam escaping from the wreckage. Gerald stepped out, brushing soot from his lab coat. He looked up at the observation window, flashing a thumbs up.
Smooth ride,
he said brightly.
When's the next test?
The researchers did not respond. Most were still frozen in place, staring at the wreckage with wide-eyed disbelief. A fire had broken out in one corner of the chamber, and the walls were now spiderwebbed with cracks. Somewhere in the distance, an alarm was blaring. The lead researcher pinched the bridge of their nose inside. "Get a containment team," they muttered, "and someone lock that man out of the garage." The mangled remains of SCP-666 were carted off in a series of reinforced crates, each one groaning under the weight of twisted metal and anomalous spite. The researchers stood in silence, watching as the wreckage was wheeled away like the aftermath of a failed magic trick. Gerald, of course, had already moved on.
"Well,"
he said, dusting off his hands, as though he'd just finished a casual chore.
"What's next?"
The lead researcher didn't look up from their clipboard. They had the tired, haunted expression of someone who had seen one too many of Gerald's successes. "Next," they said flatly, "we test SCP-682. The reaction from the room was immediate. Pens dropped, whispers broke out, and one junior researcher actually fainted. SCP-682 wasn't just a Keter-class anomaly. It was the stuff of Foundation nightmares. A colossal reptilian monstrosity with a burning hatred for all life and a stubborn refusal to stay dead. Pairing it with Gerald felt less like an experiment and more like a declaration of war. "Isn't the point of containment to, not make things worse?" someone muttered. The lead researcher ignored them, flipping through a clipboard as they continued. "The test will take place in Containment Area 7C. Gerald will be operating a specially designed vehicle equipped with enhanced safety measures." It wasn't clear if the safety measures were for Gerald or the research team. The testing chamber for SCP-682 resembled a work of art, or a desperate prayer, depending on who you asked. Reinforced steel walls stood over 20 feet high, each one lined with enough acid-resistant plating to survive a direct hit from an armored vehicle. Every corner was bristling with redundancies, hydraulic traps, chemical dispersal units, and automated restraints designed to respond faster than human reflexes. Yet, as the final checks were completed, nobody in the observation room seemed particularly reassured. SCP-682 was wheeled into the chamber on a reinforced transport rig. Even restrained, it exuded hostility. Its massive body covered in jagged scales, twisted and flexed against the harness with a strength that made the steel groan audibly. Its claws scraped against the floor, leaving deep gouges in the reinforced surface. But it was the eyes, sharp, yellow, and burning with malice, that made the room go silent. When those eyes locked onto Gerald, SCP-682 let out a low, guttural snarl that seemed to vibrate through the walls. The sound was unlike anything the researchers had heard before. It wasn't just angry, it was personal.
Is it glaring at him?
One of the junior researchers asked, their voice trembling.
Looks that way,
someone muttered. From the observation window, Gerald seemed entirely unbothered. He stood next to his vehicle, a custom-built, reinforced monstrosity of a car that looked like it had been designed by a committee of paranoid engineers. The vehicle bristled with protective measures, from reinforced steel plating to automated acid dispersal systems. Its wheels alone looked capable of withstanding a small explosion.
Big guy, isn't he?
Gerald remarked, gesturing towards SCP-682. His voice carried through the intercom as cheerful and nonchalant as ever.
You sure this thing isn't overhyped?
SCP-682 slammed its tail against the transport rig with enough force to dent the steel. The rig shuddered, and a hydraulic hiss escaped as the containment harness strained to hold its weight. Its jaws snapped open, revealing rows of teeth that looked capable of shredding concrete, and it let out a guttural roar that echoed around the chamber.
Take that as a no,
someone whispered. The reptile's snarl grew louder, its claws raking against the floor as it strained against its restraints. Its body shifted, muscles rippling under its thick scales. For a moment, it looked like it might break free entirely. Then, with a sharp hiss of hydraulics, the transport rig released, and SCP-682 stepped forward. The room tensed. SCP-682 crouched low, its tail swaying like a pendulum. Its eyes never left Gerald, who was now climbing into his vehicle. The door slammed shut with a metallic clunk, and Gerald adjusted the mirrors with practiced ease.
Feels solid,
he said, gripping the wheel. The chamber fell silent. SCP-682's nostrils flared as it took a step closer, its claws leaving fresh gouges in the floor. The lead researcher leaned forward, their hand hovering over the emergency shutdown controls. And Gerald? He just smiled. The moment SCP-682 charged, Gerald floored the gas pedal. The custom-built vehicle roared to life, its engine growling like an apex predator answering a challenge. The reinforced tires squealed against the chamber's steel floor, leaving thick black streaks in their wake as Gerald sped directly towards the rampaging reptile. For most people, this would have been the point to reconsider their life choices. Gerald, however, was entirely in his element.
Let's see what she can do,
he muttered, twisting the wheel just as SCP-682's claws came crashing down. The car swerved with an agility that no one, not even the people who built it, thought possible. Inside the observation room, the researchers watched in a mix of horror and morbid fascination as Gerald executed another sharp turn, circling around SCP-682 like a matador taunting a bull.
Is he drifting?
Someone whispered.
He's toying with it,
another muttered, their voice thick with disbelief. SCP-682's second strike missed the vehicle by mere inches, instead gouging a trench into the chambered floor. SCP-682 clearly realized it was being mocked. It roared in frustration, its claws raking against the floor as it spun to face its infuriating opponent. It lunged again, this time hurtling its entire body toward the vehicle. Gerald hit the brakes, skidding to a halt just in time for SCP-682 to overshoot its mark. The creature crashed into the far wall with a deafening thud, sending chunks of reinforced plating clattering to the floor. The chamber seemed to take a collective breath, but it didn't last long. SCP-682 recovered almost instantly, its body twisting and growing as it adapted to the situation. New, jagged spines sprouted along its back, and its claws elongated into razor-sharp talons. It let out a guttural growl that filled the room, its yellow eyes narrowing as it calculated its next move. But Gerald didn't give it the chance. He slammed on the accelerator, the vehicle surging forward like a missile. SCP-682 twisted at the last moment, its tail lashing out in a sweeping arc. The tail slammed into the side of the car with a force that could have crumpled a lesser machine, but Gerald's reinforced vehicle held firm, absorbing the blow with only a dented panel.
Not bad, Gerald remarked. She's tougher than she looks.
The lead researcher massaged their temples.
He's treating this like a test drive,
they muttered. The chaos escalated. SCP-682's next attack struck the ceiling, dislodging a section of acid containment pipes. Bright green liquid poured down, hissing as it made contact with the steel floor. The acidic fumes filled the chamber, creating a dense, noxious fog that blurred visibility. For most people, this would have been the moment to retreat. Gerald, however, seemed invigorated.
Visibility's low,
he quipped through the intercom.
Good chance to test the fog lights.
As Gerald swerved through the mist, SCP-682's attacks became increasingly frantic. The creature lashed out with claws and tail alike, but its movements lacked precision. In its rage, it struck everything except its target. A claw meant for Gerald's vehicle ricocheted off a nearby support beam, sending sparks flying. Another tail swipe tore through a ventilation shaft, unleashing a cascade of broken machinery. The researchers flinched as a random explosion erupted near the chamber's center. Inside the vehicle, Gerald seemed utterly unaffected.
Suspension's holding up nicely,
he said, his tone almost casual.
I think I'll recommend this model.
SCP-682's frustration reached a boiling point. It lunged once more, this time with enough force to shake the entire chamber. Its claws slammed into the ground where Gerald's car had been just seconds before, leaving behind a smoking crater. The vehicle darted away, tires screeching as Gerald executed yet another impossibly tight turn.
Nice try,
Gerald called out, his grin audible even through the static of the intercom.
But you're gonna have to do better than that.
The reptile let out a deafening roar, its spines bristling as it prepared for another attack. Around the chamber, acid continued to pool and sizzle. The room was a symphony of destruction. Metal groaned, explosions echoed, and the acrid smell of chemicals filled the air. But Gerald was having the time of his life. SCP-682 was no stranger to chaos. It thrived on destruction, adapting to every challenge the Foundation threw at it with almost smug resilience. But this was different. This wasn't just a battle. It was a circus act performed by a man who seemed more interested in testing suspension than in surviving. As Gerald executed yet another drift through a pool of acid, SCP-682 let out a guttural roar, its frustration echoing through the chamber. Its claws slammed into the floor with enough force to send cracks rippling outward, but the car was already gone, skidding to a stop on the far side of the room.
Give up, big guy?
Gerald called through the intercom, leaning back in the driver's seat like he was relaxing on a Sunday drive. SCP-682 snarled, baring its jagged teeth. For a moment, it looked ready to charge again. Then, something shifted. The fire in its yellow eyes dimmed, replaced by a look that could only be described as disdain. It straightened up, its spines bristling, and growled with what seemed like disgust. With that, SCP-682 turned and lumbered to the far corner of the chamber, its tail swaying in slow, deliberate arcs. The researchers in the observation room stared in stunned silence as the creature curled itself into a makeshift nest of debris, its massive body radiating exhaustion and contempt. Gerald popped the car door open and stepped out, brushing non-existent dust from his lab coat. He glanced at the sulking reptile and grinned.
I think we really wore it down,
he said, hands on his hips. His tone was so casual, so infuriatingly chipper, that one of the researchers nearly dropped their clipboard.
Well,
he said, turning to face the observation window,
I'd call that a success.
The lead researcher pinched the bridge of their nose again, muttering something about hazard pay.
Get him out of there,
they barked, waving at the nearest technician.
And someone make sure SCP-462 doesn't teleport itself into the cafeteria.
As Gerald strolled out of the chamber, he glanced over his shoulder at SCP-682.
Better luck next time, champ,
he called. The reptile's tail twitched, but it did not move. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving the chaos and an utterly defeated SCP-682 behind. By the time the dust had settled, both figuratively and literally, Containment Chamber 7C was unrecognizable. The walls were cracked and scorched, pools of acid hissed ominously on the floor, and somewhere in the far corner SCP-682 sulked in a heap. For a creature that prided itself on its resilience and hatred of all life, it now looked uncomfortably like a toddler in timeout. The researchers gathered in the observation room, hunched over monitors displaying a laundry list of damage reports. Phrases like unquantifiable vehicular chaos and spontaneous anomaly cross-contamination peppered the document, each one more damning than the last. One junior researcher rubbed their temples as they typed, pausing occasionally to look at the wreckage and sigh. And then there was Gerald, standing in the middle of the debriefing room, coffee cup in hand. He looked like he had just come back from a leisurely lunch. His lab coat was spotless, his hair perfectly in place. The lead researcher, on the other hand, looked like they'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. "Dr. Gerald," they began, their voice tight, "do you have any idea what you've done?" Gerald took a sip of his coffee, tilted his head in mock contemplation, and shrugged.
Neutralize the big guy, for one,
he said, gesturing vaguely towards SCP-682 on the monitor. The researcher let out a sharp, almost manic laugh that echoed through the room. It didn't last long. Within seconds, it crumbled into sobs, and those sobs quickly hardened into a glare sharp enough to cut steel.
"You've caused incalculable damage to the facility, triggered multiple secondary anomalies, and..."
They broke off, waving at the clipboard in frustration.
"You activated SCP-462's wreckage. How is that even possible?"
Gerald set down his coffee and folded his arms, clearly unfazed.
"Okay, but hear me out," he said. "What if next time, jet skis?"
The room went silent. "Jet skis," the lead researcher repeated flatly.
"Think about it,"
Gerald said, his enthusiasm growing. He launched into an almost impassioned pitch about jet skis, calling them the pinnacle of aquatic mobility and the obvious next step in anomaly testing.
"No,"
the researcher said, their voice brittle with exhaustion.
"Absolutely not."
The site didn't quite return to normal in the days following the experiment. Residual chaos seemed to linger like a bad smell, manifesting in odd and often inexplicable ways. A janitor reported seeing a mop teleport across 3 separate hallways, each time leaving puddles that defied all known cleaning protocols. A vending machine began dispensing cans of soup labeled dimensionally sourced broth, and someone swore they saw a potted plant rolling itself down the corridor like it was late for an important meeting. Meanwhile, SCP-682 remained in its containment chamber, eerily quiet. It occasionally twitched, its claws flexing against the floor, but the rage that had once defined it seemed dulled. When researchers observed it, they noticed its gaze lingering on the reinforced walls, its expression oddly contemplative. "Do you think it's recovering?" one researcher asked, watching the live feed.
"Well, maybe,"
their colleague replied.
"Or maybe it's trying to figure out how to never see Gerald again."
For Gerald, though, the chaos was already a distant memory. He had moved on, literally. Somewhere in the upper levels of the facility, alarms blared faintly as Gerald glided down a hallway on rollerblades, dodging startled researchers with effortless precision. A clipboard disassembled itself in his wake, bolts and hinges scattering across the floor.
"Trust me,"
he called over his shoulder to a panicked junior researcher, his voice brimming with confidence.
"This'll be my safest experiment yet."
The researcher opened their mouth to respond, but Gerald had already disappeared around a corner, leaving only the faint sound of wheels and the distant promise of more chaos to come.